Today's lecture will be on waves, triplet number 4, and we're going to explore some of the science and some of the art and some of the innovation ideas in there and how to bring those together. And triplet 4 is here, where chapter 10 of the Melodio, Brave New World, chapter 11 of the Harmonio, Eyes, and chapter 12 of the Ritmo, the dialogue, motion. And this is actually the end. Triplet number 4 is the end of the first movement of the book. For those of you who are familiar with music, many of you are, movement is analogous to the movement of a symphony. And so this is the end of the first movement of waves. So we start this discussion with chapter 10, the Melodio. The subtitle is Brave New World, and the musical inscription is Vivace agitado verso la morte. And that's a kind of very agitated speed. And so the action is quite intense in this chapter, as many of you have read. And this Brave New World is essentially Tomas going out with the team from Augustus Capital Management, the hedge fund team, Max and the others, former military, and they go and they essentially, because Max wanted that to be done, they kill the drug lord in Colombia. And of course, Thomas is a doctor and he doesn't want to do that, but that's kind of how the deal is working, and he's trying to make this into more medical aspects. Uh, and he does that in a way, as you know from the previous Melodio chapter, where he'll make the target so happy that then the killers can act without any, impediment, without any difficulty. So happiness, it becomes a very important theme in this, and happiness obviously results in the death of those targets, Diageo and his other men, and happiness is not necessarily always a good thing. It can get people in trouble, and so that's one sort of theme that we're going to explore. So this is chapter 10 here. It's in the Melodio and it's going forward into the future, as you can see. The action gets tighter and tighter. And so let's start out with uh, the first excerpt. This is right after the airplane, the A380 that Max and Tomas took. And he had forgot his headphones on the airplane. And so he was thinking about that forgetfulness. And so he writes, to Tomas, money was not the issue. It was rather that amidst these clouds of contentment, happiness, and so forth, he had lost the precious things. Happiness could be dangerous. But his forgetfulness, beyond the self flagellation, had a silver lining. It lent credibility to his plan. As Thomas had explained, the strategy was that during one of those nightclub forays, the happy ray would render Seth's honor guard so ecstatic, so satisfied that their ironclad vigilance would dissipate among a pleasing ablution of happiness. Thus unchallenged, the muscle team, Jax, Adhi, and Nigel, could then move in for the kill. So you remember in chapter 6, there was the discussion with Nora about serotonin and how uh, the brain has serotonin receptors, and that is related to mood and related to happiness and so forth. So in the previous chapter, the Melodio new plan, um, Thomas describes how he has tuned this device to activate the serotonin receptor. So some of the questions that arise: can happiness be bad? Which is an interesting question. Most people associate happiness with a good thing. But what's the big theme of this book is that many aspects of life, including technology, have both a positive and negative aspect. So we talk, for example, of nuclear power We often use that as an example. Nuclear power can have nuclear weapons too. And in the previous chapter, a drug that can be used for anesthesia can also be used to kill. So there's often two sides, and that even holds for happiness. So this discussion, this sort of human element, parallels the situation with science and technology as having these two sides. Um, so what do you think? What is your thought? Anybody want to comment? Can happiness be bad? So the next passage. Now, in order to have the guys execute, they have to avoid the happiness that this device causes. So they have some skull caps that sort of absorb some of the radiation, some of the energy. But Thomas also gives them advice that they should think of something sad. They should think of some sad moment to kind of counteract the serotonin activation that might be occurring even with the shield around their head. So he writes, or he says, Thomas's knees ached. They were sitting out in the garden. He stretched his legs, settling upon the grass, and looked about the trio, the three men. Have any of you, he asked, ever cried? Thomas realized the foolishness of such a question. The others predictably chuckled. The doctor continued seriously. Just think of the saddest, yes, saddest time in your life. That'll help you focus. This time none laughed. With the exception of Max, distantly glaring, the troika of muscle men looked down as if sharing a moment of silence. They were quiet, much like when I ask a question, contemplating the grass, freshly green in this southern hemisphere spring. Thomas let his life flash before him, seeking to conjure among his many awake nightmares his saddest moment. A cloud edged before the morning sun, the lush green turned dark. So Thomas briefly shares the story after this of Eva. So you remember chapter 8, the Harmonio Fughetta, which was a very intense chapter about mental illness and all these sorts of issues. What is your saddest moment? Uh, and again, that's a personal question. That's one reason why the men are uncomfortable answering that question, because nobody wants to share their saddest moment, but that's important as part of the strategy. So we don't need to answer that today, of course, but you may want to think, what is your saddest moment? And, there might be a positive element to that, something you learned, and so forth. So just like happiness has two sides, sadness can also have those two sides. In this case, for these people, the sadness is helping to save their life and execute their mission, in contrast to their targets, which are too happy to survive. So, at the end of this whole episode, with a lot of action, uh, Thomas's mind traveled back to Chicago. Uh, Let me actually pause for a second. Okay, so they think of the sadness as I described, and then they go into the nightclub. And here's the excerpt from a part of that scene. So let's play that here. They descended upon the cavernous strobe-lit dance floor, enveloped by a blast of pulsating Eurotrance. They descended upon the cavernous strobe-lit dance floor, enveloped by a blast of pulsating Eurotrance. The music sounds better with you. Kinetic figures twirled and whirled among the many multi-level terraces.
Several bars, shelves arrayed with glittering colored bottles, counters packed with the sweaty, sparkled in the lights. Along the circular couches, set off like cul-de-sacs from the main floor, spent clubbies lounged, plastered. The three brigands scanned the scene, full of fools, keeping in their minds whatever sadness they had mustered. As they elbowed through the crowd, Thomas had stepped behind. The roaring craze before them exploded in frenzy. Smoky, primeval, the witches danced loose. Wanton girls pushing out their chests gesticulated with their hands and more. Men gripped by gored ecstasy, roaring with laughter, groped at the gyrating curves. A flailing floozy flung off her bra, pressing, then presenting her breast to the thumping throng.
So that scene ends. They accomplish their task, and it becomes a big mystery, as you know. How did it happen, and so forth. But that's for a later chapter. And so Thomas, as they're leaving, is contemplating this situation, and he thinks back to Chicago. You remember the Chicago scene and all that. So Thomas's mind traveled back to Chicago sometime after the post 9/11 layoffs. Soon thereafter, he joined another consultancy where one of the associates shared with him the uncouth secret to success. In a knowing voice, his colleague had whispered, "Happiness sells." Happiness, Thomas brooded, indeed sells. He looked out upon the party craze and shook his head. Despite the journeys, Munich via Monaco, now Bogota, others before, he had been thwarted in bringing this now patently chaotic mission to a positive curative conclusion. The Novum Organum seemed destined to infamy, dedicated to killing rather than healing. How, as Thomas asked himself, had this happened? So, happiness sells. That's a very interesting concept. So, most of you are scientists. You want to do science, and you want to do good science, and make some discoveries. Maybe one of you will win Nobel Prize, and so forth. But if you really want to make an impact and uh, change people's minds and convince them of your science and so forth. It's not enough to do the exam and do the perfect score and just show people that you're smart. You have to, in a way, entertain them. You have to engage with them emotionally. Happiness sells. As Thomas asked himself, how has this happened? What do you think? That is, in a sense, human nature. Nobody is going to um, buy your product. If you make a company, if you want to be like a Steve Jobs or Elon Musk and so forth, just because the science is good and you're a smart guy or woman. uh, you have to make some emotional connection, and that's one of the big themes of this chapter. And indeed, one of the concepts of writing waves and publishing waves is that just doing the science around proteins and their implications and technology and so forth is not enough. There has to be a wider appreciation, an emotional feeling of this is helpful, this is good, this is making my life better, and so forth. So at the end of the chapter, there's a little bit of philosophy. I think it is important to note. And part of this chapter was inspired by my own experience with a course, Harvard professor course, Michael Sandel. Some of you may be familiar. He's famous in Korea. He wrote the book Justice, which was quite a big impact in Korea. And he was my professor. And one of the things we learned in ethical philosophy is deontology versus teleology. And that's what this passage is about. Deontology is where what is good is intrinsic, like life is good, being honest is good, and uh, being fair is good. These sorts of intrinsic good, and we call that deontology or finis operis. The process of what your action is good or determines the good. But teleology is finis operantis, means that what is the result is good. So This teleology is also called consequentialist philosophy, is closely related to the happiness principle. So, what is good is what makes people happy, uh, as opposed to some intrinsic good. And you get all these conflicts. Do we sacrifice one person for the happiness of many? Uh, we are considering the vaccine. Do we give it to everybody? Well, we can't give it to everybody. We have to give it to some people. So, what is the basis for that? Uh, and in a purely deontological philosophy, the individual person has the value. It's closely related to religious aspects, etc. So we don't sacrifice some people for the better of good of wider people. But other philosophies would say, well, some people, uh, we want to maximize the overall happiness or overall result. We call that teleology. So this is a discussion. I'm not going to read it in detail. Uh, com- Comparing deontology versus teleology. So the means versus the ends. Which ethical philosophy do you ascribe to? About. And so we have the last sentence here, last paragraph. But enough of philosophy, he thought he had just witnessed slaughter. And so he resolved that whatever the foul mouthed Max would say, whatever Maxwell's residue of lingering discontent, Max is the hedge fund manager, Maxwell is the uh, person that was mentioned in chapter 8, the chief resident in neurosurgery. Things would have to be different. The Novum's future must, he insisted to himself, be devoted towards the good and the right. Above all, operis, in other words, deontology, there was to be no more killing. Let's blow this joint, yelled Jax. So the last question, Thomas says his idea should be devoted towards the good and the right. Should scientists decide what is good and right? How should that be determined? And this is a central issue in your future careers as scientists or technologists or other things that you do. There is a philosophy that says, well, scientists should just do the science. They shouldn't be worried about the bigger issues. Uh, and then there's another concept that says that scientists should be aware of these bigger issues. My own personal philosophy is the latter. If you think about Einstein, for example, he uh, developed a lot of the science, the relativity, the equivalence of mass and energy, and so forth, that underlay the atomic bomb, the nuclear weapons, and so forth. So he actually made a position about that and wrote to Franklin Roosevelt, the American president's very famous because he thought the Nazis were developing it and so forth. So he got engaged in those issues. And there's the famous example of Linus Pauling, also a Nobel laureate chemist. Linus Pauling is mentioned in the book. And he got a Nobel Peace Prize actually for helping to develop the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that banned in air or above ground nuclear testing because of the negative effects he felt that that would have. And he approached the philosophy and the ethics as a scientist. So we're not going to answer these questions here, but I think these are important things to think about. Science is not separate from all of these issues. That doesn't mean the answers are easy, but it is worse in my mind and how the book is expressing to be not thinking about it. So now we move to chapter 11, the Harmonio. And this is about his time in some episodes in neurosurgery that was referenced in chapter 8 with the Fughetta, and this shows more details. And the subtitle to this is "A Life with Both Reason and Unreason Must Change or It Self-Destructs." So there can be sort of a meaning or a sense or a reason in life, but there can also be just fate, luck, and randomness, but these two, when in conflict, can self-destruct. And that's kind of the meta theme, and we'll see how that develops in this. So you can see chapter 11 is going back in the past as the past starts to get compressed. And so he's with Dave. That's the frame for the Harmonio chapters. And as the departure monitors above blinkered further delays, the lounge jumbled with yet more seething, stranded passengers. As I wish to share fairly disquieting thoughts, what might conceivably shock the non doctors among us, around us, I suggested we move. And so Dave and I picked up our stuff, drinks too, and sidled by the glass facade now glistening with frost. Outside, buffeted by the whipping winds, loomed the bulbous snout of a 747. I continued from where we left off. Neurosurgery, Dave, was a tale not of medicine, but of war. So note that Thomas described neurosurgery, you're supposed to be good and right, you're saving lives, as a tale not of medicine, but of war. And again, this highlights there's two sides to many things. That, we want to do good, but there can also be very bad doctors. Uh, anyway, war itself can accomplish some important and useful aims. That's just the nature of life. So, this two sided aspect is referenced in this opening passage.
Professor,
Yeah,
I think we don't have PPT slide.
this long passage is especially important for, uh, I think, in the Korean experience, because a lot of what is done is what the boss or the teacher tells you. So when I mentioned specifically about this assignment being about curiosity, that you have to choose your own webinar or seminar, and if I actually assigned it to you, that you would necessarily, by definition, fail. I know that sounds strange. It actually was a reference to this concept. So I'm not going to read the whole passage, but it goes on about how Thomas finds a patient that looks like they're abandoned. It's a neurology patient, not a neurosurgery patient. And he's wondering what it is. It's a young woman that looks like a stroke. And it was not his patient, but he wanted to do something. What was I to do? I sought out the neuromedical resident. She happened to be out by the nurse's station. Do you know about a patient, Marjorie Nelson? I asked. The resident looked down at the clipboard. No, no such patient. Looks like she might have stroked, which is a neurology problem. Can you see her? The resident cast a vacant glance up at the clock. I sighed and asked again. She's out in the corridor. Look, she replied. Without orders from my chief, I can't. And that settled that. So potentially, this patient may die, but it's not the responsibility of Tomas. It's not the responsibility of his neuromedical resident. And the question is raised: what do you think of just doing your job, just following orders? Can that, be ethically wrong? And these are all sorts of issues around that. In a war situation, if your commander asks you to kill, innocent people, whatever, I mean, that can be a war crime. Is just following orders a defense? And of course, situations are not always so extreme like that. So these are very difficult questions, and usually they don't, have any consequences. In Korea, for example, there was that very famous case with um, the Korean Air and the executive vice president, the daughter of the owner, demanded that this A380 in New York turn back and kick off one of the flight attendants because the nuts were not served in the proper way. So it's the famous nut rage case. And most Koreans will say that woman, the executive vice president, the daughter of the owner, was guilty. And in fact, she was found guilty by a court. And what's interesting to me is that in In my estimation, she's not guilty, but the pilot was guilty. And the reason the pilot is guilty is that the pilot is the boss of that airplane, and the responsibility of all the passengers and so forth is rests with the pilot, not with the owner's daughter. And the pilot should have actually either refused or basically kicked off the donor's daughter from the airplane. But she's the boss, right? So the pilot listened to the boss, and that was the wrong thing to do. Uh, Now, nobody died and so forth, but a lot of money was wasted, time was wasted, inconvenience, and so forth, embarrassment. But this kind of just blindly following who is superior to you, it can be a problem. So he actually is asked by Maxwell, the chief resident, to give some medicine through this tube. The whole chapter is about putting this tube in, so there's a lot of medical details, surgical details, which are quite interesting. And this medicine can kill the patient. So Thomas is feeling like he's ordered to kill the patient. What can he do? Can he refuse? Now, it's not definitely going to kill the patient, but it's not clear. It's very experimental. So these are some of his thoughts when he's listening to that.
The word doctor, a beautiful
Let me play that again. Sorry.
word, you'll agree, resonated in my mind. For a moment, this sullen hardened neurosurgeon, half man, half machine, felt both humbled and exalted. Strains from Brahms's first piano concerto filled my broken spirit. I wished to be defiant, to throw all this false profundity away, but that would mean defying my patient too. Feeling trapped, more executioner than doctor, I bit my lower lip and looked away. I'm sorry, your ventriculostomy is blocked. I'll be putting in some medicine that'll help that. Okay, doctor, she replied softly. I trust you. My lip quaked. Grappling against emotion, I resorted to what had always saved me. Despite the maestoso in my mind's ear raging defiant, I surrendered, yes, to my training.
So the last phrase about surrendering to training is a good thing. You know, obviously people are trained to overcome difficulties in battle and military and in very difficult situations and so forth. But succumbing to training is a kind of just blindly following. So um, in the end, that's what it's kind of like, just following what the boss says. And it's not always bad, of course, but there it is not always good either. So this is near the end of this chapter. He talks about Maxwell and how he survived, and what his motivations were. And this is a theme of Billy Budd. Billy Budd is that story by Herman Melville, and it's referenced in chapter 1 and also later on in the book. And the concept of Billy Budd is shattering the innocent is the tyrant's way of saving himself from embarrassment, sacrificing somebody so that another person, perhaps more powerful, can survive. So shall the innocent be sacrificed for the powerful? And what do you think of the final, with courage being a rarity, necessity nearly always trumps virtue? So this is related to these concepts of deontology and teleology and ethics and so forth. And it's wrapped up in this personal story. As they say in Goethe's Faust, law is mighty, mightier is the need. So law is kind of the deontology, the need or the circumstances is kind of the teleology. So finally, we end with chapter 12, the dialogue chapter, and the subtitle is Motion. And the subtitle is Proteins Are Alive with Resonant Vibrations. So the proteins, the machinery of life, are kind of alive with vibrations. And that's the theme of this chapter. So it starts here. Again, it's the end of the triplet. And these hours here, 11 a.m., and this is the name of the student, Hunt is the name of the student. And each hour, as you know, in the Ritma, is a new student. So I'll read this passage. Um, Thomas counted the money, $40 in cash and two checks, 40 and 50. That made the morning's work 140. Not bad. He checked himself. No, it actually summed up to 130. You can tell he's getting perhaps a little tired already because he made a quick or initial error in the addition. Though teaching was precious indeed, each student, measured in hourly checks, added but meagerly to his account, making little headway with his debts. Actually, he was worse off. Interest rates had risen, reinforcing Thomas's brooding conclusion that the forces of war and finance churned regardless. Like a bottle bobbing over the ocean's vastness, he could not swim free as pathetically the embattled bottle bowed urgently before the waves. The jaws of an unpitying, yawning sea would swallow it whole. Yet Thomas, inconsequent as he was, could not give up. Indeed, life was but glorified peonage, especially in America where no income meant no life. All created equal before their creator. Nobody is special except those with money, and so Thomas could not regard himself as an exception. He pictured the unseen financiers lounging by their swimming pools in the Hamptons, sipping gin and tonics. What would please them more, the ravenous flows of the cha-chinging cash each month, month by month, or the happy prospect of a cure for cancer? So Thomas reflected, for the sake of these utility monsters, he'd better get with the program and come up with the cash. You might remember the get with the program phrase from chapter 2 of Slaughterhouse in Chicago. Uh, so there's a theme in the book of this conflict between ideas and money, dreams and reality, dreams and necessity. Get with the program. And do people want to, have fancy ideas and cures for cancer, etc., because that's the good thing to do, or because it makes a lot of money? And so the other theme to this opening passage is the concept that even though he's making all this money, the interest rates are going up and it's actually getting worse. So he is influenced from the outside. He cannot totally control his fate. Outside forces are inexorable. And that's an important theme in this chapter, scientifically. So Thomas then talks about proteins and about the peptide bond. And I'm not going to read the whole passage, but he writes or he says, proteins therefore have the magical property of being both rigid and flexible. Proteins are barely solids, but they are not liquids either. So the peptide bond, which connects the amino acids in the protein, as described in the chapter, has a double bond character, so it's strong, it's rigid, but it can have single bonds around it, so it has this flexibility, so it can create all different kinds of shapes. Uh, and then he talks about Mona Lisa. And as you know, the Mona Lisa of Leonardo da Vinci is the famous painting with the smile, and the smile looks friendly from one direction, and the smile looks very devious and almost evil from another direction. So if we contemplated each grin the same as we might reflect upon the Mona Lisa, radiant one moment, sardonic the other, life, I think you would agree, would come to hope, and then there would be no more smiles. But some mysteries, those like the Mona Lisa, deserve, even demand deeper scrutiny. The peptide bond is a mystery. So when you look upon a protein, it's defined yet fluid structure. So it's defined but also fluid. Think about the peptide bond and its enigmatic blend of rigidity and flexibility, and think about the Mona Lisa. So again, this shows these opposite aspects in the same concept. Technology with good and evil, uh, or good and bad, and the peptide bond, rigid and flexible. The Mona Lisa smile, radiant and sardonic, positive and negative. Uh, so that's the connection to that metaphor in the Mona Lisa. So this is a fairly extensive quote that I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll read a certain section. So uh, the protein folds. Yes, as the protein curls up, these hydrophobic portions get enclosed within the molecule's interior. Now the surrounding solvent can relax, meaning that it returns to its normal liquid-like state. The water becomes less order. The net result for the system, the combination of the protein and the surrounding solvent, is an increase in entropy, which is exactly what the second law of thermodynamics ordered. So Hunt, the student, summarizes the second law orders the world to become disordered. That's a good way to put it. And so water is not just acting as the solvent, but also drives the process. So, in other words, the protein folding problem, which is recently there's a Nature paper about that using AI and so forth, but we won't talk about that today. But the protein folding problem is often described as here's the protein and its sequence and so forth, and the protein folds itself. But in reality, what's happening is that from a mechanistic standpoint, the outside is folding it. The outside influences. The second law of thermodynamics, which is a law of the universe, is causing it to fold, not its internal mechanics, if you will. And that parallels what Tomas is feeling when he's trying to pay his debt, and the outside world is forcing him. The outside world is determining his fate. He is like the protein that is being folded. So protein folding appears to be determined not intrinsically, but rather forced upon it by the environment. And this corresponds to the opening of the chapter where Thomas laments his situation trying to pay back his growing debt. So what's really happening is what is, as Saint-Exupéry wrote, what is essential is invisible to the eyes. That's the French writer. What's really happening, what truly drives things, is the increased disorder in the surrounding water. The essential happens behind the scene. So then he talks about the proteins are both rigid and floppy. Uh, and you see the protein is continuously vibrating. And So all of these proteins have an inherent fuzziness, a fuzziness beyond the cloudy uncertainty of quantum phenomena. Indeed, we speak of the entire protein oscillating as an undulating, vibrating shape. And they call this protein dynamics. And where's 185 here? And so this emitted terahertz radiation represents the sign of life. So these proteins are vibrating, they're emitting this radiation as a result of this vibration, which we'll talk about later. And this is why protein dynamics is very important. So he talks about the protein motions. And let me read a little bit about this passage. So Thomas starts, we know a fair bit about these protein motions. We know that these normal modes oscillate at lower frequencies than the molecular bond vibrations in the infrared range. Proteins, being colossal in size as compared to individual chemical bonds, jiggle then at lower frequencies, with some theoretical results suggesting that these range around 1 terahertz. This, in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, is smack in the middle of the so-called terahertz band. Hunt replies, really? Thomas, yes, and experimental data supports these calculations. Proteins with their well-defined resonant modes thus resemble tuning forks. Put together enough tuning forks, you end up with a musical instrument. Many such instruments make an orchestra. That's fascinating. How is it that my life will be changed? Perhaps with enough proteins, you get the symphony of life itself. So you see the vibrational frequencies, the normal modes of proteins span a wide range, though they are centered, as mentioned, mostly in the terahertz band. So this is why music is the central metaphor for the book. The music that you hear, or the music that's referenced in the videos that I shared, uh, it's not just a decoration. It describes essentially the music of life. And of course, electromagnetic radiation is not sound. but it is waves, and it's a kind of multiple frequencies, and as Thomas describes it, as a kind of symphony. Now, that may not be a scientific description. You'd obviously have to have numbers for all those frequencies and distributions and amplitudes and whatnot, just like music has notation and so forth. But that being said, uh, philosophically, it's like a musical symphony. So Thomas had said, well, this is very interesting and will change your life. So Hunt says, that's fascinating. How is it that my life will be changed? So Thomas continues, perhaps with enough proteins, you get the symphony of life itself. So you see the vibrational frequencies, the normal modes of proteins span a wide range, though they are centered, as mentioned, mostly in the terahertz band. We're approaching the end of the hour, so I'll leave you with a question. Sure. Keep in mind the image of the vibrating protein. Consider also that its vibrational frequencies and energies are lower than those in the infrared range, which is heat. Remember finally that the hydrophilic amino acids, specifically the charged ones, are distributed on the protein surface. And think of these three facts: vibration, frequency, charges too, and let's discuss next time your thoughts on the implications of this. I think you'll find the result to be significant. When you recognize what it means, you'll realize there's more to reality than what is seen, and that may change your life. So, my question to you is, what is the answer to that question? What does it mean for an object to have a vibration, a frequency, and charges? What are the implications of that? And that's what he asks of Hunt. So, we'll end with this quote. Hunt says he has an exam, so he has to focus on that, so he may not be able to answer the question. Thomas is a little bit disappointed. So he says, sure, I understand. Thomas recognized that the demands of survival, as it drummed its oppressive beat, outweighed more profound, though less weighty concerns. And for him, it had, in fact, been these tentacled fates swirling about in the guise of this economic downturn, which had brought Thomas and Hunt together. That was a good thing. But bending under the will to survive, we lose the wonder about why we survive, why, in fact, we exist. So Thomas ends with a contemplation of fate and survival as we fold, just like the protein folding, under the pressure. Do we, like these proteins, become magically alive? So next time we will do Triplet 5, and I'll try to record more, and then we'll also include the final lecture about innovation to bring everything together. This morning I did a keynote speech, which was actually a summary of all of our course and innovation and convergence and so forth. If I get a recording of that, I will share that keynote speech with you as well. Again, that was this morning. It wasn't required, but I just thought if you have time and interest, the organizers allowed me to invite my students to that webinar. So thank you very much. Any questions?